Rain fell hard on the cracked asphalt of a busy intersection in Houston, Texas, turning the traffic lights into blurred streaks of red and green. Cars idled impatiently. Engines hummed, windshields fogged, and in the narrow space between two lanes of stalled traffic, a young pregnant woman stood completely still. Her name was Emily Carter. She was 23 years old, 8 months pregnant, and she had exactly 15 pieces of candy left in the small plastic basket hanging from her arm. Those 15 candies were not just snacks. They were her dinner. They were tomorrow's inventory. They were the thin line between surviving the night and collapsing alone on the side of the road. Emily's ankles were swollen so badly that her shoes cut into her skin. Every few minutes, a sharp pain tightened around her belly, forcing her to lean against a traffic pole and breathe through clenched teeth. She knew those pains weren't normal. The doctor had warned her just 2 days earlier. Severe preeclampsia, he had said quietly. Your blood pressure is dangerously high. If you don't get surgery soon, you and the baby may not survive childbirth. But surgery required money, and Emily had none. As the rain soaked through her jacket, she lifted her voice anyway. Candy, just $1, she whispered to the passing cars. Most drivers looked straight ahead. Some rolled up their windows. A few pretended she wasn't there at all. If you're listening to this while facing something impossible, something that feels bigger than your strength, stay with this story. And if you believe that God still moves in hidden ways today, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Heaven Walks With Us. Stories like this one are shared here for a reason. Emily hadn't always been standing at traffic lights. 8 months earlier, when she discovered she was pregnant, she had been working a normal retail job and sharing a small apartment with the man she thought she would marry. But when she told him about the baby, his face had gone cold. I didn't sign up for this, he said. Then he left, blocked her number, disappeared. When Emily turned to her family, hoping for mercy, she found judgment instead. Words were said that could never be taken back. Doors were closed. And by the end of that week, she had nowhere to go. Now she slept in a women's shelter with a strict 30-day limit, and she had only 48 hours left before she would be forced back onto the streets. As the traffic light turned red again, Emily looked down at her basket. 15 pieces of candy. She had no idea that before this light turned green again, those 15 pieces would test her faith and change her life forever. Emily had learned very quickly that losing everything doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. The first thing she lost was certainty. When the pregnancy test turned positive 8 months earlier, she had stood in the small bathroom of her apartment staring at the result, her hands shaking, not with fear, but with awe. She imagined baby clothes folded in drawers, a crib by the window, late nights and early mornings that felt hard but meaningful. She told Daniel, her boyfriend of nearly 3 years, that same afternoon. At first, he said nothing. He just stared at the wall, jaw tight, eyes distant. Then he exhaled sharply and stepped backward, as if the air between them had suddenly become dangerous. I can't do this, he said. What do you mean? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't my life plan. A baby wasn't part of it. She reminded him that they had talked about the future, about marriage, about children, someday. This isn't someday, he replied coldly. And that was the moment something inside Emily broke. Daniel packed a bag that night. By morning, his side of the closet was empty. Within a week, he had blocked her number, erased his social media accounts, and vanished so completely it felt as if he had never existed at all. The second thing Emily lost was safety. She tried to keep her job, but morning sickness turned into exhaustion, and exhaustion turned into medical appointments she couldn't afford. When her manager noticed how often she needed to sit down, the conversations became tense. Hours were reduced, then shifts disappeared entirely. Rent was due, savings ran out, and panic settled in. The final thing she lost was belonging. Emily grew up in a family that talked often about values, responsibility, and appearances. When she finally gathered the courage to tell her parents the truth, she expected disappointment, but not rejection. Her mother cried. Her father didn't raise his voice. "You embarrassed us," he said quietly. "This is not how we raised you." Emily tried to explain. She begged. She promised she would work harder, do better, make things right, but the door closed anyway. "You made this choice," her mother said, turning away. "Now live with it." That night, Emily slept in her car. 2 days later, a social worker directed her to a women's shelter on the edge of the city. The rules were clear: 30 days maximum, no exceptions. At first, Emily told herself it was temporary. She would find work. She would stabilize. She would figure something out before time ran out. But pregnancy complications arrived faster than solutions. Her feet began to swell. Headaches throbbed behind her eyes. Dizziness forced her to sit down in the middle of simple tasks. And when the doctor finally spoke the words severe preeclampsia, Emily realized she wasn't just running out of options. She was running out of time. By the time she found herself standing in the rain at that Houston intersection, selling candy to strangers who refused to meet her eyes, she was no longer thinking about the future. She was thinking about tonight, about the shelter clock ticking down, about the baby inside her, growing weaker with every unanswered prayer, and about how a life could unravel so completely without anyone ever noticing. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and old paperwork. Emily sat on the edge of a plastic chair, her hands resting protectively over her stomach as a nurse wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her arm for the third time that morning. The first reading had been high, the second higher. By the third, the nurse's expression had changed. "I'm going to get the doctor," she said quietly. Dr. Miller was in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and the tired eyes of someone who had spent decades delivering bad news gently. He studied the chart, then the monitor, then Emily. "Your blood pressure is 182 over 110, he said. "That's dangerously high." Emily swallowed. Is the baby okay?" "For now," he answered honestly. "But this is severe preeclampsia. It can escalate very quickly. Seizures, organ failure, stillbirth, death." The word hung in the air between them. "What do I do?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. "You need a cesarean section, Doctor," Miller said. "Soon, not a weeks from now. Days." Relief flickered for just a second, until he continued. "The problem is," he added carefully, "the public hospital system is backed up. The waiting list is 10 to 12 weeks. Emily stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. "I don't have 10 weeks, she whispered, pressing her palm against her belly as if she could shield her baby from time itself. "I don't even know if I have 2. "Doctor," Miller nodded slowly. "I know. There is a private option," he went on. "But I need to be upfront with you. A private C-section, including hospitalization, will cost around $18,000. $18,000. The number didn't feel real. It felt abstract, like a lottery jackpot or a foreign currency she had never used. "I sell candy at traffic lights," Emily said quietly. "I make maybe $12 on a good day." The doctor closed the file. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "If anything changes, insurance, emergency funding, come back immediately." Emily walked out of the clinic with a prescription she couldn't afford and instructions that felt useless. Rest, avoid stress, monitor symptoms. But rest was impossible when your shelter bed came with an expiration date. Stress was unavoidable when your life depended on money you would never have. And symptoms were impossible to ignore when your head pounded every night and your vision blurred without warning. She returned to the shelter that evening and counted the days again. 48 hours left. After that, she didn't know where she would go. So she did the only thing she could do. She bought a bulk bag of candy with the last of her cash and went back to the intersections she knew, standing for hours under the sun, then the rain, forcing herself to smile through pain and dizziness. Each dollar felt heavy with desperation. Each contraction felt like a warning. By the morning of January 6th, Emily's body was failing her. Her feet were so swollen she could barely walk. Her head throbbed constantly, and her basket was almost empty. 15 pieces of candy remained. 15 chances to earn $1. 15 fragile barriers between her and the moment when there would be nothing left to give. And Emily had no idea that those 15 pieces were not just merchandise. They were about to become a test. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, the kind that soaked through clothes without making a sound. Emily shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to ignore the ache radiating up her legs. Each movement sent a dull throb through her ankles, swollen to the point where the skin felt stretched and fragile. She looked down at her basket. 15 pieces of candy. She counted them slowly, one by one, as if the number might change if she paid enough attention. 5 chocolate bars, 6 hard candies, 4 small lollipops wrapped in crinkled plastic. That was it. No backups. No hidden stash. No emergency money folded into a pocket somewhere. When those 15 were gone, her day was over. Her income was gone, and so was her dinner. Emily pressed a hand against her stomach as a familiar tightening wrapped around her midsection. She leaned back against the metal pole holding the traffic light, closed her eyes, and breathed through it the way the nurse at the shelter had taught her. "Easy," she whispered to herself. "Just breathe." Cars crept forward as the light turned yellow, then red again. Headlights reflected off the wet pavement, painting the intersection in streaks of white and gold. Somewhere nearby, a horn blared impatiently. She stepped forward anyway. "Candy," Emily said softly, lifting the basket just high enough to be seen. $1. A man in a pickup truck shook his head without looking at her. A woman in a sedan stared straight ahead, fingers tapping on the steering wheel. Another car rolled past as the driver pretended to adjust the radio. Emily didn't blame them. Everyone was tired. Everyone was busy. Everyone had somewhere else to be. She retreated back to the curb and glanced at the shelter wristband still wrapped loosely around her arm. The date printed on it felt like a countdown clock she couldn't stop. 48 hours. She imagined what would happen after that. Walking the streets with nowhere to sleep. Giving birth without a bed, without help, without safety. The thought tightened her chest more than the contractions ever could. "What am I supposed to do?" she murmured, her voice barely audible beneath the rain. She wasn't asking anyone in particular. Not the drivers. Not the shelter staff. Not even the doctor. She was asking God. Emily had prayed before. At night, in whispers, when the other women in the shelter slept. She had asked for strength, for mercy, for something, anything to change. So far, nothing had. She looked at the candy again. 15 small, ordinary pieces. Cheap, replaceable, insignificant to anyone else. But to Emily, they were everything she had left. As the traffic light shifted back to red and the cars came to a halt, she took a step forward, unaware that the next few moments would force her to choose between survival and something far more costly. And she had no idea that the answer she was about to give would echo far beyond that intersection. The sound reached her before she saw anything. A thin, trembling cry cut through the hum of engines and falling rain. Small, sharp, and out of place among the horns and brakes. Emily turned her head instinctively, her heart tightening at the sound. Near the edge of the crosswalk stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks in wet strands, and her oversized sweater hung loosely from her shoulders, threadbare and stained. She wore no shoes. Her bare feet were planted directly on the cold, rain-slicked pavement, toes red from the chill. The girl's eyes locked onto Emily's basket. Before Emily could move, the child ran toward her, slipping slightly on the asphalt before catching herself. She stopped just inches away, breathing hard, her small chest rising and falling. "Ma'am," the girl said softly, her voice shaking. "Can I have a candy?" Emily froze. She crouched down slowly, ignoring the protest from her aching knees. Up close, she could see how thin the child was, how her wrists looked almost too delicate for her hands, how hunger had hollowed out her cheeks in a way no child should ever know. "It's raining," Emily said gently. "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated, then pointed toward the sidewalk. Emily followed her gaze. A few yards away, huddled beneath the shallow overhang of a closed storefront, sat a young woman with her back against the wall. Her coat was unzipped, stretched tight over a very pregnant belly. Beside her were three more children, all younger than the girl standing in front of Emily. None of them wore shoes. None of them were dry. None of them were eating. "My mom's over there," the girl said. "She's really tired." Emily's throat tightened. "And why do you want the candy?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. The girl's eyes filled with tears. "It's January 6th, she whispered. "My little brothers were waiting for something, but Christmas is over, and we didn't get anything. Not even one candy." Something inside Emily cracked. She glanced back at the woman on the sidewalk, then at the children clinging to her sides. 4 kids. 1 pregnant mother, 5 mouths to feed, 6, if you counted the baby on the way. Emily looked down at her basket. 15 pieces of candy. She did the math without meaning to. If she gave 1, she could still sell the rest. If she gave 2, she might still eat tonight. If she gave more, her hand tightened around the basket handle. She felt another contraction ripple through her body, sharper than the last. She breathed through it, her free hand instinctively covering her stomach. The little girl noticed the movement. "You're going to have a baby too," she said quietly, her eyes wide with concern. "My mom says babies are a blessing." Emily smiled weakly. "Yes," she said. "They are." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to fall. The traffic lights stayed red. Cars idled. Drivers impatient, unaware that something sacred was unfolding just a few feet away. The girl looked at the basket again, then back at Emily's face. "Just 1 is okay," she said quickly. "You don't have to give me more." Emily swallowed hard. She had prayed for help. She had begged God for a sign. And now, standing in front of her, barefoot and hungry, was a child asking for almost nothing at all. Emily had no idea yet that this simple request was not an interruption to her prayer. It was the answer. Emily stayed crouched in the rain, her eyes moving between the little girl and the basket in her hand. The world around them seemed to slow, as if the intersection itself were holding its breath. 15 pieces of candy. She knew exactly what each one represented. The 5 chocolate bars could be sold quickly. Drivers liked those best. The hard candies were cheap but steady. The lollipops, bright and wrapped in color, were usually what children begged for. If she sold them all, she might earn $15. Enough for a small meal. Enough to buy another bulk bag the next morning. Enough to keep going one more day. One more day. Emily's mind raced ahead to the shelter clock ticking down. 48 hours. Then nothing. No bed. No shower. No address to write down when the hospital asked where to send follow-up paperwork. Her baby shifted inside her, a slow, heavy movement that made her wince. She pressed her palm against her belly and felt a wave of fear rise in her chest. "I have to think about my baby," she whispered, almost to herself. The little girl nodded solemnly, as if she understood far more than a child her age should. "My mom says that too," she replied. "She says she keeps going for us." Emily closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw the doctor's tired face, heard his voice again. "You don't have much time." She remembered the shelter intake worker explaining the rules without looking up. 30 days. No exceptions. She thought of the nights she had cried silently into her pillow so the other women wouldn't hear. The prayers she had whispered, not asking for miracles anymore, just asking not to die. And now, here it was. A choice she hadn't expected. A test she hadn't prepared for. Emily looked again toward the sidewalk. The pregnant woman sat hunched forward, arms wrapped around herself, trying to shield her children from the rain, with a body already carrying too much. One of the younger boys coughed, a deep, rattling sound that didn't belong in such a small chest. "How many siblings do you have?" Emily asked softly. 3, the girl answered. "And 1 more coming." Emily nodded slowly. 6 people. She counted again. 15 pieces of candy. If she gave them all away, there would be no dinner, no inventory for tomorrow, no reason to stand at this intersection again. She would go to bed hungry, She would wake up with nothing. A horn blared suddenly, jolting her back into the moment. The traffic light was still red, but drivers were growing restless. Time was running out, on the light, on the day, on her life as she knew it. Emily opened her eyes and met the girl's gaze. The child wasn't demanding. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just waiting. Emily felt something settle in her chest then. Not relief, not certainty, but resolve. A quiet, terrifying clarity. She straightened slowly, her knees trembling as she stood. The rain soaked through her sleeves as she lifted the basket and walked toward the sidewalk. "Come here," Emily said gently. "Call your mom. Bring your brothers too." The girl's eyes widened. "All of them?" Emily nodded. "All of them!" The child turned and ran, slipping once before catching herself, her bare feet slapping against the wet concrete. Within moments, the pregnant woman stood, confusion written across her face, gathering the children around her as they approached. They moved cautiously, like people who had learned not to expect kindness. Emily set the basket down between them. Without ceremony, without speech, she began to hand out the candy, one to each child, then another, then another. The children stared at their hands as if the candy might disappear if they looked too closely. The mother covered her mouth, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. When Emily reached the bottom of the basket, she placed the remaining pieces into the woman's hands. "All of it," she said quietly. "For you and your husband, and for the baby." The basket was empty. Emily stood there in the rain, her stomach hollow, her future uncertain, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and peace she had never felt before. She had given everything she had, and she had no idea what would happen next. The family didn't leave right away. The children stood in a loose semicircle around Emily, unwrapping their candy with hands that trembled, not from the cold anymore, but from disbelief. One of the boys stared at a chocolate bar as if it were something holy, turning it over twice before finally taking a careful bite. The pregnant woman tried to speak, but her voice broke. She nodded instead, pressing the candy to her chest with both hands, as though it might anchor her to the moment. A thin man stepped out from the shadows behind the storefront. Her husband, Emily realized, his shoulders slumped, his eyes wet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill. "Please," he said, holding it out. "Let me pay you. Just something." Emily gently closed his fingers over the money and shook her head. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Take care of your family." The man nodded, unable to speak. The mother mouthed a thank you again and again as they gathered the children and moved away down the sidewalk, the rain softening their outlines until they disappeared into the gray. Emily was alone again. She looked down at the basket in her hands, empty, lighter than it had ever been. The traffic light changed from red to green, then back again. Cars flowed past, indifferent. The intersection returned to its rhythm as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had changed. Emily felt it in the quiet space inside her chest, where panic usually lived. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had loosened its grip. In its place was a strange stillness, almost like peace. She turned a step back toward the curb and heard small footsteps behind her. Emily froze. Slowly, she turned. The little girl stood a few feet away, alone. No brothers, no mother, no father, just her. The child's face was dry now, her eyes calm, almost luminous in the glow of the traffic lights. She smiled, not a wide, playful smile, but something gentler, older. "You forgot something," the girl said softly. Emily knelt despite the ache in her knees. "Did you drop your candy?" she asked, glancing around. The girl shook her head. She stepped closer and looked at Emily's belly, round and stretched beneath her jacket. "You have a baby," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Emily replied, resting a hand over her stomach. "Very soon." The girl lifted her small hand. Before Emily could react, the child placed her palm gently against Emily's belly. Warmth surged instantly through her body, deep, steady, unmistakable. Not the fleeting heat of friction or nerves, but something richer, fuller, like sunlight breaking through cloud. Inside her, the baby moved. Not a weak flutter, not a subtle shift, a strong kick. Emily gasped, her breath catching in her throat. It was the first time in weeks her baby had moved with strength. Tears sprang to her eyes as she pressed both hands to her stomach. The girl looked up at her and smiled. "My mom says you're an angel," she whispered. "So I wanted to give you a gift too." Emily's heart pounded. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she took a step back. And then, everything changed. The air around her shimmered, as if the rain itself had begun to glow. The outline of the child blurred, light folding inward and outward at the same time. Emily tried to speak, but no sound came out. In the space where the little girl had been standing, something else was taking shape. Something radiant. Something impossible. Emily dropped to her knees, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts, as realization struck her with the force of a wave. The test was over, and she was no longer alone. Emily couldn't move. Her knees were pressed against the wet pavement, her hands trembling as they hovered uselessly in front of her chest. The rain no longer felt cold. In fact, she barely felt it at all. Light filled the space where the little girl had stood. It wasn't blinding. It wasn't harsh. It was warm, alive, like the glow of the sun breaking through clouds after a long storm. The air itself seemed to breathe, expanding and settling with a quiet power that made Emily's heart race. And then she saw him, not as a child, not as a man from a painting, but as a presence that felt more real than anything she had ever known. He knelt before her. His face was gentle, strong, familiar in a way she couldn't explain. His eyes held a depth that felt endless, like oceans layered with stars. When he looked at her, Emily felt completely seen. Every tear she had cried in the shelter. Every night she had gone to sleep hungry. Every silent prayer whispered through fear and shame. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You don't need to be afraid," he said. His voice was calm, steady, carrying both authority and compassion at the same time. It wasn't loud, yet it filled the space completely, rising above the rain, the traffic, the city itself. Emily collapsed forward, pressing her forehead to the ground. "I'm not worthy," she managed to whisper, her voice breaking. "I failed. I made so many mistakes." A hand touched her shoulder. The moment his fingers made contact, warmth surged through her body, deep and immediate. It wasn't just comforting, it was healing. She felt it move through her like a current, from her head down to her feet, settling into places that had been aching for months. "You gave when you had nothing," he said. "You shared your last meal while carrying life inside you. You loved without knowing who stood before you." He lifted her chin gently. Emily Carter. Hearing her name spoken that way, without judgment, without anger, made her sob. "You shared your last 15 pieces of candy," he continued, "while hungry, homeless, and afraid. You did not ask who deserved it. You simply gave." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, unable to speak. "For this," he said, placing his hand over her stomach, "your child will live." Heat spread instantly beneath his palm. Emily gasped as something shifted inside her. Not pain, not pressure, but release. The constant tightness she had carried for weeks began to dissolve. The pounding in her head faded. Her chest expanded as if she were breathing freely for the first time in months. "You will live," he continued calmly. "Your body is healed." Emily looked down in disbelief. The swelling in her feet was receding before her eyes. The burning ache in her legs vanished. The dizziness lifted, replaced by clarity so sharp it made her dizzy all over again. Her baby kicked, strongly, deliberately, once, twice, 3 times. She cried out, clutching her belly, overwhelmed by relief. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "you will go to Memorial Hermann Hospital, 8 a.m. Emily's breath caught. "I don't have—" "It is already paid," he interrupted gently. "Every cost." Her eyes widened. "You will have a private room," he continued. You will recover in safety. Your son will be born healthy." "My son," she whispered. He smiled. "His name will be Emmanuel. God with us." Emily shook as she cried, the weight of the moment pressing down on her heart. "There is more," he said. She looked up. "A home is prepared for you," he continued. "An apartment not far from here. It belongs to you. No debt. No fear of eviction." Emily could barely process the words. "And what I placed in your hands today," he said softly, "is not meant to end with you." She felt his hand touch her forehead. Peace flooded her. Not the absence of problems, but the certainty of presence. The knowledge that she had never been alone, even when it felt that way. "I was with you in the shelter," he said quietly. "I heard every prayer. I counted every tear." Emily sobbed openly now. "This trial was not punishment," he continued. "It was preparation." Slowly, he stood. "Rise, daughter," he said. "Your story of pain becomes a testimony of grace." The light around him intensified for just a moment, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. No retreating footsteps, no fading glow. He simply was not there anymore. Emily remained kneeling in the rain, her hands pressed to her stomach, her heart pounding. For a long moment, she wondered if she had imagined it. Then she looked down. Her basket, empty just moments before, was overflowing. Candy spilled over the edges. Chocolates, lollipops, bright wrappers she had never sold before. More than she could count, more than should have fit. And resting on top was a plain white envelope. Emily reached for it with shaking hands, her breath shallow. Whatever came next, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Emily stared at the basket as if it might vanish if she blinked. Moments earlier, it had been empty, so light it barely registered in her hands. Now it was heavy, brimming with candy and colors and wrappers she didn't recognize. Chocolates stacked atop one another, lollipops pressed against the rim, hard candies glinting like small jewels beneath the streetlight. Her heart hammered. This wasn't possible. Slowly, carefully, she set the basket on the curb and touched the candy with trembling fingers. The plastic crinkled. The wrappers were real, solid, cold from the rain. Emily's breath came in short bursts. Then she saw the envelope. It was plain, white, unmarked, resting neatly on top of the candy as if it had been placed there intentionally. Her name was written across the front in calm, deliberate handwriting. Emily Carter. She picked it up, half expecting it to dissolve in her hands. It didn't. She opened it. Inside were 3 documents and a folded check. Her eyes moved from one to the next, struggling to understand what she was seeing. The first page was a hospital confirmation, typed, official, unmistakable. Scheduled C-section, date, tomorrow, time, 8 Wheeler A.M., facility, Memorial Hermann Hospital, balance, paid in full. Emily's knees weakened. She leaned back against the pole, clutching the paper to her chest. The second document was a cashier's check, $120,000. She counted the zeros twice. Then again, the amount made her dizzy. The third was a property deed, an apartment. Her name listed clearly as the owner. No liens, no mortgage, no fine print explaining it away. Emily slid down onto the curb, the rain soaking through her jeans as tears streamed freely down her face. "This can't be real," she whispered. "This can't be real." Her mind searched desperately for explanations. Shock, hallucination, a stress-induced break. The doctor had warned her that severe preeclampsia could cause confusion, delusions, visual disturbances. Her heart raced. With shaking hands, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out the small, digital blood pressure monitor the shelter kept for shared use. She wrapped the cuff around her arm, her movements clumsy with fear. "Please," she murmured, unsure who she was speaking to. "Please let me know." The device whirred softly. She waited. The screen blinked. 120/80. Emily stared at the numbers. Normal. Perfect. She tried again, tightening the cuff more firmly this time. The result didn't change. The crushing headache that had followed her for weeks was gone. The pressure behind her eyes, gone. The swelling in her feet, nearly gone. She stood carefully, testing her weight. No dizziness. No pain. Emily pressed both hands against her belly as another strong kick answered her touch. Her baby was alive. Strong. Present. A sob tore from her chest, raw and unrestrained. She looked up at the intersection, at the cars, the rain, the blinking traffic lights, and everything looked the same. Yet nothing was. Emily gathered the envelope and documents, tucking them carefully into her jacket. She lifted the basket, surprised by its weight, and held it close as if it were something fragile and sacred. For a moment, she didn't know what to do next. Then instinct took over. She turned away from the intersection and began to walk toward the bus stop, her steps slow but steady. Each movement felt unreal, like she was walking through someone else's life. At the shelter that night, Emily didn't speak much. She climbed onto her narrow bed, sat beneath the dim overhead light, and laid the documents out one by one. She touched the check, the deed, the hospital confirmation. They didn't disappear. Around her, the other women slept, unaware that a miracle had unfolded just hours earlier on a rain-soaked street corner. Emily lay back and stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding, not with fear this time, but with awe. Tomorrow morning, she would walk into a hospital she had never dreamed of entering as a patient. Tomorrow morning, her child would be born in safety. And for the first time since the day she saw the positive pregnancy test, Emily allowed herself to believe something she hadn't dared to hope before. She was going to live. And somehow, against all reason, everything had changed in a single night. Morning arrived without sleep. Emily watched the pale light creep through the shelter's narrow windows, her mind replaying every detail of the night before. The envelope lay open on her lap. The papers were still there. The numbers had not changed. Neither had the calm in her chest. At 7:15, she stepped into a taxi for the first time in months. "Memorial Hermann Hospital," she said softly. The driver glanced at her in the mirror, then at her belly. "Big day," he said kindly. Emily nodded, her hand resting over the steady rhythm beneath her ribs. The city passed by in wet streaks of concrete and glass. She had stood on these streets selling candy for weeks, never imagining she would cross them this way, headed somewhere safe. The hospital rose ahead of them, all steel and light, its entrance framed by glass doors that slid open with quiet efficiency. Emily hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside, suddenly aware of her worn shoes, her borrowed jacket, the thin backpack holding everything she owned. At the reception desk, a woman greeted her with a practiced smile. "Name?" "Emily Carter," she replied, bracing herself. I have a scheduled C-section." The receptionist's fingers paused over the keyboard. She typed again. Her expression changed. "Yes," she said, looking up now with a different tone entirely. "Ms. Carter, we've been expecting you." Emily blinked. "You have?" The woman stood. "Please follow me." They moved quickly through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and quiet urgency. Nurses glanced up from their stations. A man in a white coat nodded as they passed. In a private pre-op room, a nurse named Karen checked Emily's vitals. She wrapped the cuff around her arm and frowned slightly at the monitor. "That can't be right," she murmured, then took the reading again. "What is it?" Emily asked. "Your blood pressure," Karen said, eyes widening just a little. "It's completely normal." Emily swallowed. "That's good, right?" "It's excellent," Karen replied, "especially given your referral notes." Minutes later, a tall man with silver hair and calm authority entered the room. "Ms. Carter," he said, offering a warm smile. "Sigh, I'm Dr. Reynolds, head of obstetrics." Emily's hands trembled as she shook his. "I've reviewed your records," he continued. "Severe preeclampsia diagnosed less than 48 hours ago. And yet," he gestured toward the monitor, "your vitals are stable, remarkably so." Emily didn't know what to say. "There's something else, Doctor," Reynolds added. "Your procedure has been fully covered, A donor arranged everything: surgery, recovery, a private room. Uh, We were instructed to give you the highest level of care. Who? Who was the donor? Emily asked. The doctor checked the file. It's listed as anonymous. Emily nodded, tears welling in her eyes. They prepared her quickly but gently. Nurses explained each step. Warm blankets were placed over her shoulders. The room felt calm, reverent, almost, as if everyone sensed they were standing inside something unusual. As they wheeled her toward the operating room, Emily closed her eyes. She didn't beg this time. She whispered a thank you. The lights above the surgical suite were bright, but not harsh. Instruments gleamed. A team of professionals moved with quiet confidence. Dr. Reynolds leaned closer. Are you ready? He asked. Emily nodded, tears slipping down her temples. I've been ready for months. The anesthesia took effect. Pressure replaced pain. Time blurred. And then, a cry. Strong, clear, alive. It's a boy, Dr. Reynolds announced, lifting the newborn into view. 3.2 kilograms. Perfectly healthy. Emily sobbed as they placed her son against her chest. His skin was warm, his breath steady, his tiny fingers curled instinctively around hers. Hello, Emmanuel, she whispered. Around her, the room seemed to pause. The monitors hummed. The staff exchanged glances that carried quiet wonder. Doctor, Reynolds looked back at the chart once more, then at Emily. I've practiced medicine for 30 years, he said softly. And I don't say this lightly. He met her eyes. What happened to you has no medical explanation. Emily smiled through her tears. I know, she said. And for the first time, no one argued with her. Emily didn't sleep much during the first night after surgery. It wasn't because of pain. The medication kept her comfortable, and the nurses checked on her with quiet precision. It was the weight of reality that kept her awake. The slow realization that everything she had feared for months had been replaced with something she didn't yet know how to carry. Emmanuel slept on her chest, his small body rising and falling in the steady rhythm. Every so often, his fingers twitched, as if he were reaching for something even in sleep. Emily traced the curve of his cheek with a fingertip, afraid that if she looked away too long, the moment might vanish. She watched the monitors, listened to the soft hum of machines, counted each breath he took. Alive, strong. Here, by morning, sunlight poured through the wide window of her private room, illuminating a space that felt more like a quiet hotel than a hospital. Clean sheets, fresh flowers, a tray with real breakfast, warm food she hadn't tasted in weeks. A nurse named Angela came in with a gentle smile. How are we doing today? Emily hesitated. Honestly, she said softly, I don't know. Angela laughed kindly. That's normal. You've been through a lot. Emily nodded, but the truth went deeper. As the adrenaline faded, questions crept in, quiet at first, then insistent. Why me? Why now? What happens next? She had the documents, the check, the deed. The miracle was undeniable, but miracles didn't come with instructions. Later that afternoon, Dr. Reynolds returned to check her incision. He paused longer than necessary, studying the chart again. Your recovery is unusually fast, he said carefully. Your blood pressure remains perfect. No complications. Emily met his gaze. It wasn't always like this. I know, he replied. And that's what troubles me. He hesitated, then continued. I've seen rare recoveries before, but not like this. Not overnight. Emily looked down at Emmanuel, then back up. I don't think I was healed just for myself, she said quietly. Dr. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Curious. What do you mean? I think, Emily said slowly, choosing each word, that I was spared for a reason. That night, after the visitors were gone and the hallway lights dimmed, Emily lay awake again, this time not in fear, but in reflection. The shelter, the intersection, the 15 pieces of candy, the child's hand on her belly, and the words that still echoed in her heart. What I placed in your hands today is not meant to end with you. Emily understood then that the miracle wasn't complete. It had begun with healing, but it wasn't meant to stop there. She looked at Emmanuel sleeping peacefully beside her. I don't know how, she whispered, but I promise, I won't waste this. For the first time since everything fell apart, Emily wasn't asking God to save her. She was asking him to show her how to give back. And somewhere deep inside, she sensed that the answer was already forming, quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment she would be ready to listen. Emily spent the next few days moving carefully, not just because of the incision, but because her life felt newly fragile, like something precious that could be mishandled if rushed. Nurses came and went. Emmanuel slept, fed, and slept again, perfectly content, as if he had always known he would arrive safely. On the fourth morning, Dr. Reynolds stopped by with a clipboard and an unusual smile. There's a reimbursement, he said, handing her a small envelope. The donor overpaid. Hospital policy would normally return it, but the instructions were clear. Any excess goes to you. Emily opened it slowly. $30,000. Her hands shook, not with greed, but with responsibility. That afternoon, she packed her things and walked out of the hospital, carrying Emmanuel in a borrowed carrier, sunlight warming his small face. Outside, a rideshare waited to take her to an address she had memorized, but still didn't quite believe. The apartment was modest, clean, and quiet. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, light streaming through windows that looked out over a row of trees. Everything worked. Everything was hers. Emily sat on the living room floor, Emmanuel sleeping against her chest, and let the silence settle. This is real, once she thought. This is happening. But as the days passed, something unexpected crept in alongside gratitude. Fear. Not the kind she knew from hunger or abandonment, but a quieter fear that whispered questions late at night. What if I lose this? What if I fail? What if I waste what I was given? Emily remembered the words again. Not meant to end with you. One night, while Emmanuel slept beside her, she dreamed. She was standing in a bright kitchen filled with shelves stacked with boxes of candy. Not just a few bags, but hundreds, thousands. A laptop sat open on the counter, orders flashing across the screen. Wholesale, bulk delivery, vendor pickup. Emily woke up with her heart racing. Candy. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake Emmanuel, and laughed softly in disbelief. Candy was the only business she had ever known. The streets had taught her what sold, what didn't, what desperate people needed to survive a day. The next morning, she opened a notebook and began to write. She divided the money. One portion for Emmanuel, diapers, food, emergencies. One portion to prepare the second bedroom as storage, and one portion, carefully measured, for inventory. Emily visited a wholesale distributor on the edge of the city, Emmanuel strapped close to her chest. The owner, a gruff man named Luis, eyed her skeptically at first until she placed a cashier's check on the counter. I want fair prices, she said. For street vendors, people like I used to be. Luis studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. I can do fair. Boxes arrived the next day. Emily stacked them carefully, labeling shelves by type and price. Ironie. She created simple flyers at a local print shop. Candy wholesale. Fair prices, small credit available. Then she went back to the intersection, not to sell, to invite. Vendors she recognized stared at her in disbelief. Some thought she was lying. Others thought she was crazy. You're selling cheaper than anyone, one man said suspiciously. I know, Emily replied. You deserve to earn more. Within 2 weeks, she had 20 regular buyers. Within a month, 50. Emily kept her margins small and her promises firm. If someone needed a week to pay, she gave it once. If they were honest, she helped. If they weren't, she didn't argue. She simply moved on. The money grew steadily, but Emily didn't keep all of it. Every Friday, she set aside a portion, sometimes 10%, sometimes more, and returned to the places she knew best. Shelters, clinics, corners where people stood invisible, just as she once had. She didn't announce herself. She didn't explain. She gave. One evening, a familiar face appeared at her door. Her parents. They stood awkwardly in the hallway, older than she remembered, their confidence worn thin. "We heard you're doing well," her father said carefully. Emily listened. She didn't rush. When they finished, she nodded. "I forgive you," she said simply, "but I won't hand you money." Their faces fell. "I will offer work," she continued. "If you want it." They accepted. Slowly, painfully, trust began to rebuild, not through words, but through consistency. Months passed. Emily's small operation outgrew the apartment. She rented a modest warehouse and hired help. Women from the shelter, men from the streets, people no one else would take a chance on. Revenue stabilized. Growth followed. But Emily never forgot the measure that mattered most. Every January 6th, she returned to that same intersection, with boxes of candy and an open heart. Because the miracle had not been the money, or the healing, or even the home. The miracle was that what began with 15 pieces of candy had become a river, flowing outward, touching lives she would never fully count. And Emily knew, without doubt, that this was exactly how it was meant to be. 3 years passed quietly, not in headlines, not in sudden miracles that shook the city, but in steady mornings, honest work, and small acts of generosity repeated again and again. Emily was 26 now. Her hair was longer. Her face carried lines earned not from age, but from responsibility. Emmanuel, nearly 3 years old, walked beside her with a careful seriousness that made strangers smile. He held her hand tightly as they crossed the street, his small fingers warm and sure. Every January 6th, without exception, Emily returned to the same intersection. The traffic lights were newer now. The storefronts had changed, but the rhythm was the same. Red, green, pause, go. Emily stood near the curb with large cardboard boxes stacked behind her, each filled with candy. 5,000 pieces this year. Bright wrappers, familiar sweetness. Emmanuel pointed excitedly as children gathered. "Candy?" he asked, eyes wide. Emily knelt beside him. "Yes, sweetheart, for everyone." They handed them out together, one by one. No questions asked, no explanations given. A vendor approached, a man Emily didn't recognize. "Why do you give it away every year?" he asked. "You could sell all of this." Emily smiled, looking down at Emmanuel. "Because once," she said softly, "I gave away everything I had." The man waited. "I was standing right here," she continued, tapping the pavement with her foot. 8 months pregnant, homeless, sick. I had 15 pieces of candy left, and a little girl asked me for one. Emmanuel listened intently, as if hearing the story for the first time, even though he had heard it 100 times before. "She needed it," Emily said. "So I gave them all." The vendor shook his head in disbelief. "All of them?" Emily nodded. "All of them. And then what?" he asked. Emily looked around, at the children laughing, at the vendors she now supplied at fair prices, at the life built not from luck but from obedience. "Then Jesus showed up," she said simply. That night, as they walked home under the soft glow of streetlights, Emmanuel looked up at her. "Mommy," he asked, "will Jesus come back again?" Emily stopped walking. "Okay." She crouched to his level and brushed rain from his curls. "He already does," she said gently. "Every time we share, every time we help someone who's hungry, every time we love when it's hard." Emmanuel thought about this seriously. Then he nodded. "I want to help people too." Emily's throat tightened. She pulled him into a hug, breathing him in, this child who had survived when he wasn't supposed to, this life that began with a miracle and continued with purpose. That night, after Emmanuel fell asleep, Emily stood by the window of their modest home and looked out at the city. She thought of the shelter beds, the clinic chair, the rain-soaked intersection. She thought of fear, how it once ruled every decision she made, and she thought of the truth she had learned, that miracles don't begin with abundance. They begin with surrender. Emily never became famous. She never sought recognition. Her business stayed modest, her life simple. Okay, but everywhere she went, the impact followed. Vendors earning enough to feed their families, women from shelters finding stable work, children receiving kindness without conditions, all because of 15 pieces of candy. If you're listening to this and feel like you're at the end, like you don't have enough strength, enough money, enough hope, hear this clearly. Emily didn't give because she was strong. She gave because she trusted. And when she gave from her poverty, God responded from his abundance. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you're believing for. And if you want to walk with stories of faith, miracles, and quiet obedience that still change lives today, subscribe to Heaven Walks With Us, because miracles didn't end in the Bible. Sometimes they begin at a traffic light with 15 pieces of candy and a heart willing to give them all.